Hello everyone, welcome back to another video on the JayBee Milly channel. I am JayBee, and today I'm going to be doing a bit of a review slash podcast reviewing Scooby Apocalypse Volume 1. So this is part of the Volume 1 collection, so if you're listening to this or watching this and you're thinking of either buying the issues separately, if you've read the issues separately, for context, this is covering issues 1 to 6. So for all, I treated this as one singular book, as in Scooby Apocalypse 1 versus a compilation of those issues. I think it's important for context that that's the approach that I came at this with, all as one story versus, okay, that was good issue 1, but issue 2 let it down a bit. Like, I really didn't think about it like that. But more on that context, I think it's important for me to ascertain that I am not a comic book reader or a graphic novel reader for the most part. I used to be a lot when I was going through high school and sixth form, but for the last 5 or 6 years I haven't picked up one graphic novel besides the Miss Marvel one in preparation for that series coming out. So I'm not completely on board with that type of format or that style. Not to say I don't like it, but it's one that I'm not too familiar with. Usually I'm interested in reading big novels and things without pictures, just loads and loads of text. So it was difficult for me to connect with the format just in general. So if I'm a bit negative about this review, then please do forgive me on that front. But it's so interesting. I feel like this is going to be the closest to an actual raw review that I've ever done in the whole process of this YouTube channel. So that's when we did it with people, when it was just me and Milly. Like, I feel like this is different because I really don't know if I need to be more vocal on my criticisms because it's an over-hated series, or if I need to be over-vocal on my praise because it's, you know, an underrated or maybe a series that everyone loves. Like, and that's not to say I edit my opinions at all, but it's like, so for instance, I kind of feel like the 2002 movie is overhated, so I'm going to be more vocal on what I did like about it to even myself out a bit, whereas this, I don't know. So I do have the book with me now. So I'm just going to be flicking through this while I discuss certain things because I want to remind myself on the story, but also I want some extra context and some examples. So I'll say this much. I really did not enjoy the first couple of pages, and that's being generous. I'd say maybe the first 15-20 pages I just couldn't get into at all, and I don't know what it was. I think it was my preconceived notions of an apocalypse or what this story was about. I was expecting The Walking Dead meets Scooby-Doo. So let's say the Scooby Gang, they're on a normal mission, but then they wake up post-apocalypse the next day, like Rick Grimes style. Or perhaps they're involved with a mystery where they think they're chasing a zombie, but then it's actually real and chaos ensues. You know, something like that. Something that we get the formula of what it was, and then we get that juxtaposed or contrasted with this new apocalypse format. Whereas I found the start was a little bit confusing. So we see Velma by herself, bit of a lone wolf, and so instantly I'm kind of thinking, is Velma her own character? Like, what is this setting? Why is she here? And then she is playing with something that's like futuristic. And because obviously the vibe of the cover, I was expecting at some point this would be set in a future timeline. So I'm thinking, okay, is this before the outbreak? Is this after the outbreak or the apocalypse? Because Waterstones kind of did me a bit dirty in the description, whereas they actually said that it was a zombie apocalypse story. And so instantly I'm waiting for a zombie apocalypse. I think that was part of the stuff going into it. If you're expecting like Marvel zombies but for Scooby, just get that out of your mind entirely, because I'm going to give a few parallels to this. It actually reminded me more of the Cronenberg episode from Rick and Morty than it did The Walking Dead or 24 or 28 Days Later and stuff like that. So yeah, I was a bit confused about the timeline. And just flicking through, the whole vibe of the start really didn't sit well with me. So I think eventually in these graphic novels, they show full art pages, which I think represent what would be a front cover of an issue. So I'm looking at one that's, you know, Scooby Apocalypse waiting for the end of the world. Okay, fair enough. But then the front cover is a massive giant looking thing a feather creature. There's a load of robot sci-fi things going on in the background, and so I'm like, okay, I understand the notion of an apocalypse, and even if it isn't zombie, my preference is that we need to see civilization before the downfall and then after, and you can kind of argue, well, they didn't really do that in The Walking Dead until Fear the Walking Dead. They just showed normal cops and then he's waking up post apocalyptic. But I'm kind of like, true. But that was live action format. There was a normal police car that you could see in America. There were people that looked like people that we could know in the real world. Therefore, I could imply that that version of New York looks like New York, or that version of London looks like the London that I know, for instance. And so when he is waking up post-apocalypse, I can go, oh my gosh, like the world is completely, effed, for lack of a better word. Whereas now I'm like, okay, we're in a crazy different futuristic world. There's monsters already roaming about the place, so what's going to change? Like, where are we? What does the world look like? And what's it going to look like after? Because who's, to say that if the world is overrun by monsters, well, isn't that just what was happening anyway? Like, I don't know if there's a prelude to even Volume 1, but I just feel like they haven't shown us the real, the normal world to then contrast it with the apocalypse. It's just weird world, gets even weirder, and it's a bad thing because the characters are saying that it's bad. So, yeah, the start really didn't connect with me. And just looking at her, one thing I do like instantly is the different characterizations, I think, again, it would be a little bit better for me personally if it was the standard Scooby-Doo formula and then it's flipped on its head. But then, that's not the way it plans out here. And you quickly do learn that, and I'm going to try and stay, as spoiler-free as possible, but we get to a situation where the gang, some of them are together, some of them aren't. It's very almost Zombie Island at the start of Zombie Island. You get those team-ups, those dynamics. So I was a fan of that, and I got to terms quite quickly that this isn't the breaking of the mold in terms of Scooby-Doo zombie apocalypse. This is a what if, essentially. So what if the Scooby Gang formed under these circumstances, or what if they were these characters not thrown into this scenario but born into this scenario? So I kind of, and again, that's almost selling the story of, oh, it's always the apocalypse, but it's different, but there's not really a way that I can describe it. There were words about, criticizing the Velma show online, like why not just make Scooby Apocalypse? Scooby Apocalypse stays more true to the franchise, to the characters. And in terms of that, I will say that the characters, there are some changes, but overall I do see that point. These are definitely a different version, but of the characters that we do know for the most part. I'd say the person that's changed the most is even like Fred, because I think Fred, they almost try and do with Fred in this a little bit of what the 2002 movie did for Shaggy. They kind of leaned into his stereotypes a little bit. So, for instance, everyone says that Shaggy's a stoner. That's not something I believe, but then obviously they had him passing the Dutchie and everything in the 2002 movie. The shipping between Fred and Daphne is something that's quite debated in the Scooby fandom, and so that's fully led into with Fred here. But that's kind of all. Like, these are definitely the characters we know, even in basis terms. So Velma, I don't see too much about Velma in this, but also I don't see too much of Velma that isn't in this. She's sassy, she is very quick-witted, and she's the smart one that's translated to her. Daphne, such an evolution for her. Like I say, when you think about Daphne and Zombie Island, this is pretty much that version of Daphne, but I'd even say this version of Daphne is a little bit tougher. There were things that I had issues with, like I think she's a bit too quick for violence, but, it's the apocalypse, what do we expect? Maybe my favourite adaptation is Scooby, because they give proper reasons why Scooby is the way he is. Not only that, but they also give us a very adult, mature, but grounded Shaggy. I think this is the Shaggy that people wanted from a more adult version of Scooby-Doo. Like, I was more one for the 2002 movie, but making adult Shaggy doesn't mean, stoner, doesn't mean stereotypes about this. Like, this is a very real adult man, but he loves his dog. He loves dogs in general. Like, I think they do maybe the best job adapting Shaggy in this version. And so that's the vibe that we're going through there. Overall, I think the start is shaky, especially like I said, when we get to that triggering event of the apocalypse, because then I was kind of thrown for a loop. Like, what is the apocalypse? What does it actually mean? What does it look like in this universe? Because I know what it would look like in our universe, but here I'm like, okay, it's the same settings, but things are on fire. And then when we start to get post-apocalypse, I do think again I'm almost worse off having been familiar with The Walking Dead and stuff before reading this, before, consuming this piece of media, because there's some very good, I wouldn't say drawn out philosophical debates, but there's some very humanizing parts in this where the characters will get rid of, I guess creatures for lack of a better word, and they'll debate with themselves about the morality of this, if it's right to kill the creatures, if it's wrong to kill the creatures, and that's fine. I know in my mind that that's an essential part of starting an apocalypse, because you're either not going to root for characters that are fully up for that anyway, like right at the start, or, there's a bit of red flags there. But at this point, it's like nothing that I'm reading in this is new, because it's something that I feel is so played out in stuff like The Walking Dead that it's like, yes, this debate is very interesting. Like, yeah, I know you feel guilty about killing these monsters, but like they're monsters, can we cut out maybe half of this debate and get on with the story? Like, so there was a bit of conflict there. I knew the book was doing the right thing, debating all these moral questions, but quite frankly, within this genre, I'm kind of over it personally, but that's just maybe me being tainted from other things that I've seen and read in this media. I do want to shout out the artwork because it's second to none, to be honest. Like, I've read some graphic novels in the past, or I've lingered over a few of the artworks, and I think the way they make these a grittier version, like all the monster designs, like second to none, genuinely. Like, some of the things that they make here are so creative, and I'd actually love to see some of these creatures be translated over to an animated Scooby-Doo project. Obviously, you're gonna have to like tamper down the gore and stuff, but I'd like to see some of these designs. There was a moment that I had quite an issue with it, and that's some of the timing. I know comic books often do little speech bubbles where they'll say, this is 2 days later or 5 weeks later, but there's a moment, maybe from looking at it in issues, between issues 2 and 3, maybe 3 and 4, where the gang are trapped in a warehouse or a garage, and there's a load of, monsters swarming them. We go from that to the start of another issue, which then has conversations, and then all of a sudden Fred is injured. And I understand that later on, if you keep on reading, they explain why, but it was a little bit like, okay, at this point I'm going back and checking if there was any time indication, like if at the start of this issue it was, this time later. And obviously you can say, well, if the mystery machine or the car was outside, clearly this is after those events. And it doesn't take a genius to figure that out, but in the moment, because I was in full flow with this, and obviously I'm reading this, bear in mind, as one continuous book, it was a little bit like, okay, if I'm taken out of this for a little bit, it's breaking the illusion. Like, instantly I'm not in the vehicle with the Scooby Gang on this journey. I'm not scared like the Scooby Gang are. I'm JB sat reading this confused. And just that little bit of immersion breaking is kind of threw me off a little bit. But, if you're not the type, like, maybe if you're more used to reading graphic novels, you're going to be more in tune with this. Because bear in mind, I'm used to reading books where maybe the only pictures are like the little illustrations after it says chapter 1, 2, 3. So when I see that, the mystery machine, when I see the wastelands, I'm not thinking instantly, this is where they are. It's, okay, this is cool artwork as the front cover. So yep, I can see why that's on me, but there are situations that I need to point out where it did confuse me a little bit, and I won't lie about that. I don't know who it was. I mean, I can see some names on here. You got Keith Giffen, J.M. de Matisse, Howard Porter, but someone clearly has quite a love for Scooby-Doo involved within this. There's a couple of Easter eggs about some of the original actors' surnames. You've got some art Easter eggs, and I really did like that because I actually wasn't expecting any Easter eggs. Like, I was almost forgetting that there was even a wider Scoobyverse when, going through this. It really did do a good job when it was immersing me in doing so. Like, I felt like I was on the ride with some of these characters, but those little Easter eggs there, I'm just thinking to myself, like, wow, like, whoever worked on these must have really appreciated that original franchise. And so I did think it was excellent, and there were some things in this that you don't normally get with Scooby-Doo projects. And I'm not talking about the blood and the gore, because honestly, they don't really lean into the blood and the gore, which I was very impressed and surprisingly, okay with, because it really doesn't need to. I think the things that you get is interactions between, say, Shaggy and Fred. Like, those two have a moment around the middle of this volume, and it was really good. It wasn't any, character building in terms of, let's give you some backstory, let me relate to it, but it was just like a conversation that a friend would have with a friend. That I'm like, wow, I can see that if these are the conversations these group of, misfit, like motley crew people are gonna have at the start, I can completely see why they would be the Scooby Gang that we know and love by the end of it. And even if they're a different version of that, they are building up that dynamic, and I think they did it absolutely amazingly. There is some choppy moments where the characters will be in jeopardy. They're going to be in imminent danger, but because it's a book, because it's a new series, they have to build character, they have to make us care about them. They're going to put the pause button on and give us a load of dialogue. Like, I think Velma, Daphne, they're in imminent danger, but they have a moment where Velma completely, exposition dumps on Daphne. And the only thing that kind of saves it is Daphne then responds with something like, oh, well, I don't remember requesting for a massive backstory, And I always say this, just because it's self-aware doesn't mean it's not done that thing. But in this case, it was self-aware enough to at least go, oh, well, I'm not the only person that noticed that was out of nowhere. So, Velma, she says she's not very gregarious, she's not very talkative. We actually see here, maybe that's part of her character, because I think she's the only one that does it. That maybe now that she does have that social interaction, she's kind of telling anecdotes that she's been, wanting to tell for a while now. So that was the only little bit there. I will say, for people that didn't like the 2002 movie for a specific small furry reason, I don't know how this plays out, which is why I'm not, spoiling it or speaking much about it, but I think this would annoy you a bit. But that's all I'm going to say about that. In terms of everything else, I don't think there's much to say. I expected this to be a massive review, a massive podcast, but I think I'm actually going to be able to wrap it up relatively quick. There's just a few last things that I want to discuss, and that's subversion of expectations. So, one trope that I really dislike in apocalypse fiction is we get a group of characters, they're built up, we either hate them or we love them or we're ambivalent to them, but at some point in the story they pick up either another survivor or usually a kid character. And they set all of that up here to do that, and then it's like, oh god, is it gonna be a situation where there's a kid introduced and protecting the kid and saving the kid is the driving force behind everything? Like, does the kid need to get to a certain location like in Logan, or are they gonna be the key to everything like in War of the Planet of the Apes? And for all I dislike those two examples, I'm like, I've seen this so many times, I'm over it. The way that they almost sold it like that was going to be the case and then subverted it, I think was really well done, because Everything from the art, from the build up, it all made me think one thing, and then genuinely managed to surprise me in a way that I was so surprised that a graphic novel could do. And again, not speaking down to graphic novels, it just simply isn't a medium that I usually am involved with. But this issue really has taught me that there's some real drama to be had in in these pages. So that's what I'll say about that. And finally, this is where the issue kind of ends, and it's where I'm going to end the review. If you've watched the channel, I'm really not a fan of Velma. And I'm not just talking about the HBO Max version, I'm talking literally about every single Velma. Apart from apart from BJ Ward, Mindy Cohn, Linda Cardellini, and that's just them as actors, And I even think Marla Frumkin is overhated to heck. So there's a lot of times where just the character in general, not the people behind the voices, even though I've had my criticisms about Kate Micucci's voice, like the character of Velma, I've never been able to connect with. But I gotta say, the backstory that this gives Velma, I think, is excellent. It's superb. Is it a little bit cliche? I guess so. But I don't think I've ever seen Velma in the light that this story depicts Velma as. Because they give her a backstory, and I can just relate to it to so many levels. Her feeling of isolation. Like, Velma in the back of this book was pretty much me at school, from how her parents were with her, how her classmates react to her. I've obviously not got the brains of Velma, but you can imagine it from a point of view where you can feel a bit like an outcast, even in a group of people that are that seem like outcasts. And it is weird. I feel like you can interpret a lot of modern day Velmaisms, if you will, within that story. And I'm not going to say, oh yeah, this is the first thing that made that canon, or I don't even think it is, but you can interpret it that way, and it gives the story a whole new depth. And even if you don't want to interpret that, the story in and of itself, the surface story that it gives you, is still impactful. And so I just think, like, there's so much that you can unpack from the Velma story that elevates it to a point where if you want to dig deeper, you've got a story. If you want to just read it as it's presented, it's a good story. Like, every way you slice that is good. Now, the question is it worth continuing? Yes. I would smash Scooby Apocalypse Volume 1. And I'm so glad that I'm able to, because I really did think, after reading the first few pages, that I was going to have to make a video saying, yep, sorry guys, it wasn't for me. I didn't like it. I don't see why people were praising this when all the Velma controversy was going on. It wasn't for me. I genuinely thought that I was going to have to say, I didn't like it, but power to people that do. But I'm happy to say that Scooby Apocalypse grew on me, and I'm absolutely addicted to this story, and I can't wait to get volume 2. So what did you think about the first volume of Scooby Apocalypse? Have you read it? What did you think? Please let me know down below. And if you do want to see more reviews, podcasts, interviews, then please like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.